So I want you to just take a second and think about a physical ache you have right now.
Yeah, we all have one, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, maybe it's just, a dull throb in your lower back from sitting at a desk way too long today.
Mm.
Or maybe you're dealing with something much more severe than that.
Right. The kind of stuff that really alters your day-to-day life.
Yeah. Think about a time you stood by a hospital bed. You're just listening to that rhythmic, mechanical hum of a heart monitor, right?
Mhm.
And you're watching someone you love suffer.
It's a heavy thing to picture, but we all encounter those moments at some point.
We do. And when we do hit those moments, there's always this specific question that kind of echoes in the back of our minds. You know, where does this misery actually come from?
Right. What is the root cause of the pain?
Yes. And I mean, we are so quick to point to biology or, genetics or just circumstantial accidents like, oh, it's just bad luck. But today, we're going to look at an entirely different explanation. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we're doing a deep dive into two extensive theological essays regarding the origin of human suffering.
And it's worth noting these essays base their arguments entirely on the historical account of Genesis 3.
Right. So the whole mission of our deep dives today is to really figure out the historic biblical explanation for pain. And we're going to contrast that with some of the modern philosophical theories that attempt to answer that exact same question.
And that is really the core issue we are tackling today, because before we get into the weeds of the theology, let's look at the backdrop of the material we're analyzing.
Yeah, lay it out for us.
So the sources we're working from, they present a very specific historically Protestant argument. They assert that pain is, it's a judicial reality resulting from a literal historical fall.
A judicial reality. Okay, that's a big phrase.
It is. And these texts explicitly push back against modern theories that try to blend evolutionary biology with the biblical text.
Right, which is super common today.
No, very common. The authors actually directly confront works like C.S. Lewis's famous book, The Problem of Pain.
Right. I think a lot of people listening have probably read that one.
Yeah, it's a classic. Lewis was attempting to defend the Christian faith against the charge that pain somehow invalidates divine goodness. But the authors of our sources, they argue that Lewis and, a lot of modern thinkers like him made massive concessions to modern scientific assumptions.
Concessions that, according to these essays, compromise the biblical narrative.
Precise.
Okay, let's break that down right away. Because if we really want to understand the origin of suffering, we have to look at what the original state of humanity looked like before the concept of an ache or even a tear ever existed.
Right. You have to go back to the very beginning.
We have to look at the garden. So the sources bring up a specific argument made by C.S. Lewis. He hypothesized this scenario where God took long centuries to perfect an animal form.
Right, like an evolutionary process.
Yeah, an evolutionary process that eventually resulted in what Lewis called a naked, shaggy-bearded, slow-spoken creature.
That's quite a mental image.
It really is. And according to Lewis's theory, this creature existed for ages in this primitive state before it finally gained, a new kind of spiritual consciousness and actually became human.
And this right here is where the sources offer a really sharp, unyielding critique. The texts argue that synthesizing Darwinian evolutionary biology with the Genesis narrative, it just creates an impossible theological contradiction.
Walk us through that contradiction. Why is it impossible?
Well, think about the implications of the timeline. If death and disease and predation existed for millions of years before this shaggy-bearded creature was granted a soul, then death is just a natural component of creation.
It's just a normal biological mechanism.
Right. It's just how the world works. But the biblical text, especially as it's understood through historic Protestant theology, insists that death is the wages of sin.
Oh, I see. So if you have death before sin?
You have a massive theological problem. God declared the original creation very good. If millions of years of animals tearing each other apart preceded human existence, then violence and death were part of that very good design.
Rather than being a judicial punishment for human rebellion.
Yes. And the sources argue that Adam was not some primitive hominid struggling to master basic language.
Right. The texts paint a totally different picture.
They really do. They say he was created with an unclouded intellect. He possessed pristine taxonomical precision.
Which is how he was able to name the animals with absolute accuracy.
Spot on. He had complete moral sensitivity and this unhindered communion with his creator. He wasn't a caveman.
Okay. I want to make sure I'm grasping the real scale of what you're saying here. Because if I accept the whole shaggy-bearded savage idea, It sounds like Adam was essentially like a beta version of humanity,
A beta version, yeah.
like a rough draft that God was slowly upgrading over time, patching bugs in the software as he went along.
That's a good way to put it.
But reading through these texts, I get the complete opposite impression. The argument seems to be that Adam was not a rough draft at all. He was the master copy.
Yes, the absolute master copy.
He was the supreme human archetype of wisdom and beauty and moral perfection. He was the highest pinnacle of earthly creation,
Yeah.
not some stepping stone climbing out of an animal past.
And that is the core argument the sources are making, and it's huge because it changes everything about how a person understands the concept of sin.
How so?
Well, think about it. If Adam was just a primitive brute who barely understood his own consciousness, his fall into sin is pretty much a predictable slip.
Like a toddler making a mistake.
Yeah. You almost can't blame a slow-spoken savage for messing up. It minimizes the scale of the catastrophe. But if he was the pinnacle of creation, possessing this pristine moral clarity and perfect intellect, his fall is not just a stumble.
It's a calculated decision.
It is a catastrophic, voluntary, and highly calculated rebellion against a generous creator. It's cosmic treason committed by a fully capable being.
Wow. Cosmic treason.
The authors argue that modern people want to lessen the severity of the fall by lessening the capability of the man who fell.
That makes a lot of sense. But it also brings up a massive logical problem.
Okay, what's that?
Well, if Adam was in this state of absolute perfection, the mechanics of his failure require some really close scrutiny. I mean, how does a perfect being living in a perfect environment with zero external trauma or internal corruption just decide to rebel?
Right, he had no bad childhood to blame.
Exactly, or I should say, that's right. He had no genetic predispositions to addiction or anger or greed, nothing. So that brings us to the anatomy of the temptation itself and how the enemy subverted that perfect authority.
It's a fascinating sequence.
So the fruit is eaten, the cosmic treason is committed, but what actually happened in the moments leading up to it?
The literary details of Genesis 3 that the text highlights here are just brilliant. Moses, the author of Genesis, uses a specific phonetic wordplay in the Hebrew text to set up this entire conflict.
I love when we get into the original Hebrew. What's the wordplay?
So at the end of Genesis 2, Adam and Eve are described as being naked, which in Hebrew is the word arumim.
Arim.
Right. And it indicates this state of childlike innocence and unashamed vulnerability. Then, in the very next breath, in Genesis 3.1, the serpent is introduced as being crafty or subtle. And the Hebrew word for that is arum.
Oh, wow. Arumilam and arum. They sound almost identical.
They do, and the authors argue this phonetic link intentionally contrasts their pristine physical vulnerability with the enemy's lethal intellectual deception.
It's like the text is telling us the serpent's craftiness is about to exploit their innocent vulnerability just by the sound of the words.
Yeah, it's a literary red flag. And the sequence of the serpent's attack, as detailed in the source, is a total masterclass in psychological manipulation.
It really is. The texts break this down into very distinct steps. And I noticed that breakdown, and it is chilling when you look at the progression.
It's very calculated.
First, the serpent drops the covenant name of God. Up until this point in the biblical narrative, God is referred to as Yahweh.
Right, the covenant name.
Which is his intimate relational name.
Yeah.
But the serpent shows up and uses the title Elohim. And I know Elohim is still a valid name for God, but I need you to explain the difference there for someone who doesn't read ancient Hebrew. Why does that specific word choice matter?
It matters heavily because of the emotional and relational weight of the words. Yahweh is the name God uses when he is making promises, when he's walking in the garden, when he is acting as a father to his creation.
Okay.
But Elohim is a more distant, transcendent term. It focuses on sheer power and creator status. To give you a modern equivalent, imagine a child who always calls their mother mom.
Yeah, that implies warmth, safety, provision.
Right. Now imagine a stranger comes up to the child and starts referring to the mother as the legal guardian.
Oof, that's cold.
It is technically accurate, but it strips away all the warmth. It introduces a subtle emotional distance. The serpent uses Elohim to frame God not as a loving father, but as this distant, restrictive deity.
That is a great way to put it, the legal guardian. So once that distance is established, the serpent asks a probing question. Did God actually say?
Notice he doesn't start with a command to disobey.
Right, he starts by inducing doubt. He frames God as restrictive, like, is God really keeping this from you? And Eve's response, man, It shows the poison is already
It
working.
happens so fast.
She misquotes the command. First, she adds her own legalistic restriction by saying, "Neither shall ye touch it," which God never actually said.
God just said not to eat it.
Yeah, and then she softens the penalty. God said they would surely die, but she says, "Lest ye die."
Making it sound like a mere possibility rather than an absolute certainty, like, oh, you might die.
Well, spot on. So what does the serpent do once he sees that hesitation?
This is the climax of the temptation. Once he sees that tiny opening, he abandons all subtlety entirely. The serpent uses the exact Hebrew absolute infinitive that God used.
The absolute infinitive. Explain that.
So God said, "Thou shalt surely die," which is this emphatic grammatical construction in Hebrew. Motamot.
Atamut.
Right. The serpent uses that exact same emphatic construction, but he inserts a flat negation. Loma temutun.
You shall not surely die.
Yes. The source text calls this the birth of all liberal theology.
Wow, the birth of liberal theology.
Because it's the very first explicit denial of divine judgment. The serpent is offering a rival interpretation of reality. He's suggesting that disobedience won't bring death, but rather enlightenment and autonomy.
Okay, I have to stop right here and ask about Adam's role during this exchange.
This is a crucial point.
Because the popular image, mostly from Sunday school books and Renaissance paintings, is that Eve was all alone, wandering the garden, and Adam was off somewhere else naming animals or pruning bushes or whatever.
That's how everyone pictures it.
But the sources specifically note Adam's silent, active compliance. He was right there with her.
He was standing right next to her.
He wasn't deceived by the serpent's theology. He willfully participated. If I'm trying to picture this, it sounds like a security guard standing watch at a bank.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Right. A robber walks in, starts emptying the vault, and the security guard doesn't just watch it happen. He actually holds the door open for the robber on the way out.
Yeah, he facilitates it.
Adam was supposed to guard the sanctuary of Eden. His silence was a deliberate, cold abdication of his headship and his duty to protect his wife and obey his God.
Your security guard analogy captures the severity of his inaction perfectly. He wasn't a victim of circumstance here. He made a calculated choice to listen to the voice of his wife over the voice of his creator.
He chose creaturely autonomy.
He did, and the text highlights that the Apostle Paul later confirms this in the New Testament when he writes that Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived.
So Adam sinned with his eyes wide open.
Completely wide open. He traded the glory of God for the approval of a creature.
In this precise moment of rebellion, it triggers a consequence that alters the physical fabric of the universe. The fruit is eaten. The cosmic treason is committed.
The world changes in an instant.
But what actually happens? Does the sky immediately turn black? What takes place in the literal next second, moving from the temptation to the immediate aftermath? Because this introduces the origin of the pain we were talking about at the start of the show.
Well, the promise of the serpent was enlightenment, right? He said their eyes would be opened and they would be like God.
Right.
Well, their eyes were indeed opened, but the result was a bitter parody of what was promised.
A bitter parody.
Yeah. Instead of divine glory, they gained a terrifying, accusing conscience and deep physical shame. They suddenly know they're naked, and their immediate reaction is to sew fig leaves together to cover themselves.
Which is such a weird instinct when you think about it.
It is. And the source text identifies this moment, the sewing of the fig leaves, as the historical birth of human self-righteousness.
Oh, man. The birth of self-righteousness.
Yes. It is the futile attempt of fallen humanity to cover their own moral shame with their own manufactured works.
And when they hear God walking in the garden, they run and hide. The relationship is completely shattered.
It's broken.
Now, here's where the text brings up another major critique of C.S. Lewis. And this is specifically regarding how the physical world changed in that moment.
Right. Getting back to the origin of physical suffering.
Yeah. Lewis suggested a theory for this. He thought that when the human spirit rebelled against God, the human soul essentially lost administrative control over its physical organism.
He viewed the body as an organism that the soul was managing.
Yeah, that's what he was saying. And because of that loss of control, ordinary biochemical laws just took over. And that's what caused the body to experience pain and disease and eventually senility.
So Lewis framed it as a passive, natural consequence of a spiritual breakdown.
Right, a passive biological side effect.
Yeah.
But the texts we're reviewing aggressively reject this idea.
They reject it wholeheartedly, because framing the curse as a passive biological accident fundamentally undermines the justice and holiness of God.
How so?
The sources view the curse as an active forensic imposition by God acting as a righteous judge. It's a legal sentence.
Oh.
Look at the text of Genesis. When God addresses the woman, he says he will multiply her pain in childbirth. When he impresses the man, he creases the ground to bring forth thorns and thistles, demanding sweat and exhausting toil.
And then the ultimate sentence.
Right. Finally, he decrees physical death, turning the dust-formed man back to dust. These are not ordinary biochemical laws slipping out of control because the soul lost its grip.
They are active decrees.
Yes. These are penal sentences handed down in a cosmic courtroom. God actively subjected the physical creation to futility as a direct punishment for cosmic treason.
So let's bring this back to you, the listener. When you feel physical exhaustion from your job or when you are facing a severe physical illness, the text argues you aren't just feeling the friction of complex biology.
No, you're not.
You are feeling the tangible, historical reality of God's active curse against sin. It's like a physical sermon reminding us that the world is broken because humanity rebelled.
Yeah, pain is a judicial reality. It's a constant marker of the broken covenant. The creation groans because it was subjected to a curse by its creator, not because its molecular structure just happened to degrade over time.
The authors really want the reader to grasp that God is sovereign over the curse.
He is the one who imposed it.
But that raises a massive logical and ethical question.
Yeah.
And the sources dedicate a lot of space to answering this, so I want to dig into it. I need to push back here on behalf of anyone listening.
Go for it.
A modern listener is going to hear this and think, I was not in the garden. I did not eat the fruit. Why am I paying the penalty for something someone else did thousands of years ago?
It's the most common objection.
It really is. How does a sentence handed down to one man legally apply to every single person born today?
And that brings us to the concept of federal headship and the transmission of guilt. The source relies heavily on the Apostle Paul's teaching in Romans chapter 5 for this.
Romans 5, okay.
The text introduces the doctrine of immediate imputation.
All right, I'm going to need you to explain immediate imputation in plain English. What does that actually mean?
Okay, so imputation is an accounting term. It means to credit something to someone's account.
Like crediting money to a bank account.
Yes. And immediate means it happens directly, without any intermediate steps. It's not passed down biologically over generations. So the doctrine of immediate imputation teaches that Adam did not act as a private individual.
He wasn't just acting for himself.
Right. He acted as a federal representative for the entire human race.
Federal representative.
Think of a federal government representative signing a treaty on behalf of a nation. The citizens of that nation didn't personally sign the document, but they are legally bound by the terms.
Because their representative signed it.
Yes. When Adam stood in the garden, he stood in our place. When he fell, the legal guilt of his sin was immediately credited to the account of every human being descending from him by ordinary generation.
So we legally sinned in him and fell with him.
That is the historic Protestant view.
The text mentions C.S. Lewis's attempt to explain this using another analogy. Lewis talked about a badly brought up boy who is introduced into a decent family.
The bad boy analogy, yeah.
Yeah. The boy's character is damaged. He does terrible things. But Lewis says it's not his own fault that he was brought up that way, even though he does need to be reformed.
And the texts view this analogy as a devastating departure from Protestant orthodoxy.
Why is it so devastating?
Because they argue it turns the fall into a psychological or biological misfortune rather than a legal condemnation.
Ah, I see.
It softens the guilt. So if I'm hearing you right, the authors are saying it's less like passing down a genetic predisposition to a disease and more like a CEO signing a disastrous fraudulent contract.
A fraudulent contract that legally bankrupts an entire company.
Yes. Every single employee loses their pension, their job, their security. They lose everything. Not because they personally signed the fraudulent contract, but because their legal representative did.
So we are born legally bankrupt before God.
The bankrupt CEO is a highly accurate analogy for what the sources are communicating. And the authors argue that rejecting this strict legal framework actually destroys the logic of Christian salvation.
Wait, how does it destroy the logic of salvation? That's a huge claim.
It is a crucial point that many modern people miss. If humanity is not legally condemned in the first Adam, if we are just biologically spoiled or badly brought up, as Lewis suggested, then we cannot be legally justified by the second Adam, Jesus Christ.
Oh, because salvation is also based on representation.
Yes. The entire structure of the gospel relies on representation. We are born legally guilty, possessing what theologians call total inability.
Let's define total inability as well, because that's another heavy theological term. I assume it means we are unable to do something specific.
It means that fallen human beings are completely unable to choose spiritual good on their own. It's not that people are just, sick with sin and need a little medicine.
Right.
The biblical text describes humanity as spiritually dead in trespasses and sins. A dead person cannot choose to accept a life preserver.
Man, that is stark.
It is. The human will is in absolute bondage to sin because of Adam's rebellion. Unless God intervenes, humanity will always freely choose to rebel.
The bleakness of this legal condemnation is incredibly heavy. I mean, we're talking about absolute spiritual bankruptcy and a physical curse that brings death to everyone.
It doesn't get much darker.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
But the sources point out that this dark backdrop sets the stage for the specific mechanics of the rescue plan.
Right, God doesn't just leave them there.
God doesn't just hand down the sentence, lock the gates of Eden, and walk away. He introduces a promise right in the middle of the judgment.
And what's fascinating here is that before Adam and Eve are even driven out of the garden, God speaks to the serpent and delivers what theologians call the protevangelium.
Protevangelium. Okay.
Yeah, this is found in Genesis 3.15.
That sounds like a Latin legal term. What does it actually translate to?
It translates roughly to the first gospel.
The first gospel.
Yeah.
Right there in Genesis 3.
Yes. It is the very first promise of a savior. God says, He will put enmity between the serpent's seed and the woman's seed. He promises that a singular male descendant of the woman will crush the serpent's head, though the serpent will bruise his heel.
It's the promise of a conquering seed who will suffer a wound, but who will emerge completely victorious over the enemy who caused the fall.
Right. And the text draws an incredible contrast between the two Adams based on this promise.
The two Adams, first Adam and second Adam.
Yeah. Think about the first Adam, our first federal head. He failed in a perfect garden surrounded by absolute abundance.
He had everything he could ever need. Perfect fellowship, perfect food, perfect surroundings.
And he still rebelled against a single restriction. Now look at the second Adam, Christ. He triumphed in a hostile wilderness while fasting for 40 days.
Wow. The contrast is night and day.
He was surrounded by wild beasts, experiencing intense physical hunger and weakness, and yet he stood firm on the word of God, perfectly obeying where the first Adam failed.
The sources highlight a highly specific and honestly breathtaking detail regarding Christ's passive obedience during his crucifixion.
This part is amazing.
We have to remember the specific curses handed down in Genesis 3. God cursed the ground to bring forth thorns and thistles as a physical sign of his righteous judgment against the earth.
Right, the thorns are the curse.
Fast forward to the historical accounts of the Gospels. During the crucifixion, the Roman soldiers mock Jesus by twisting together a literal crown of thorns and pressing it into his head.
It's not a coincidence.
No. Furthermore, Adam was cursed to eat his bread by the sweat of his brow. It was a symbol of agonizing labor and distress under the curse. In the Garden of Gethsemane, facing the terrifying reality of the wrath of God, Christ sweat drops of blood in his agony.
I love how the text points out that these physical details of the crucifixion are not just random acts of historical cruelty.
They aren't just horrible things that happen to happen.
No, they are a sovereignly orchestrated absorption of the exact physical curses pronounced in Genesis 3. Christ didn't just die a generic death. He actively took the specific markers of the curse, the thorns, the sweat, the tree itself, and bore them in his own body.
He was legally absorbing the penalty that the first CEO, Adam, had incurred.
He was paying the bankruptcy debt.
He acted as the perfect substitute. The legal requirements of the broken covenant were fully satisfied by the second Adam.
He lived a life of perfect obedience, fulfilling the righteous requirements of the law, and he died a substitutionary death, absorbing the wrath of God.
Which reverses the curse for all who are represented by him through faith.
Well, that's spot on.
Now, the authors of these texts do not leave this as ancient history or abstract theology. They apply these strict theological categories to modern controversies.
They bring it right up to the present day.
And we are stepping into some heavily debated territory now. To be totally clear for you listening, we are not endorsing this view. We are just mapping out how the authors of these texts apply their Genesis theology to modern politics and sociology.
Right, we're just reporting what the sources say.
The text uses this theology of the fall to denounce several modern ideological movements.
The texts are very explicit in their contemporary applications. For instance, the authors target the modern movement of egalitarianism in the church and the home.
Okay, unpack that.
They argue that Genesis 3.16 establishes the doctrine of complementarianism.
Which is what?
Well, when God tells Eve that her desire will be for her husband and he shall rule over her, the authors interpret this as a description of the curse disrupting a previously harmonious order.
So they see the battle of the sexes as part of the curse.
Yes, they argue that the struggle for authority between sexes, where a wife seeks to usurp leadership and a husband responds with harsh domination, is a direct result of the fall. Therefore, the authors defend strict gender roles, arguing that attempting to erase distinct roles of male headship is a submission to the curse itself, rather than a return to the created order.
Man, they pull no punches. And the sources then move on to outline a sharp critique of the social gospel and movements like critical race theory.
This is another major point of application for them.
According to the authors, these movements falsely blame human suffering, inequality, and pain on corrupt social systems and systemic structures.
Instead of blaming it on original sin,
Right. The authors argue that these ideologies divide humanity based on physical characteristics, like skin color or economic class. And they assert that the only division among humanity that actually matters before God is covenantal standing.
federal headship again.
Yes, you're either legally represented by the first Adam in sin, or you're legally represented by the second Adam, Christ, in righteousness.
In their view, suffering is caused by the pervasive nature of human sin and the divine curse, not by systemic societal structures.
The authors argue that any attempt to cure societal ills through political activism or social restructuring or wealth redistribution, rather than relying on regenerating grace and the preaching of the gospel, is a modern form of Pelagianism.
We should definitely define Pelagianism for the listener.
Yeah, please do. That's another big one.
Pelagianism is an ancient heresy named after a monk named Pelagius. He taught that human beings are essentially born good without original sin and can choose to be righteous by their own free will.
So denying the whole total inability thing we talked about earlier.
Right. He believed people could earn their way to heaven by trying hard enough. And the authors argue that modern social justice movements operate on a similar secular premise.
How so?
They view it as a humanistic illusion that man can save himself and fix the brokenness of the world without the substitutionary atonement of Christ.
Fixing the world through our own works.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, that's their critique. For the authors, true justice and restoration can only come through the spiritual regeneration of individuals under the new covenant, changing hearts one by one, rather than changing laws or social systems.
Wrapping up our discussion today, let's bring the focus back to the immediate personal takeaways regarding the origin of pain. The main argument from the sources is that human misery, whether it's the ache in your back or the heavy grief of a hospital room, is not a biological accident.
It's not.
It is not an evolutionary byproduct of a world slowly figuring itself out. According to the text, it is the direct result of a historical rebellion by humanity's federal head, Adam.
That rebellion resulted in an active judicial curse upon the physical world.
A curse which was eventually absorbed and satisfied by the second Adam, Jesus Christ, on the cross.
And understanding your pain through this lens strips away the illusion of human autonomy. It really forces a person to drop the fig leaves of self-righteousness.
Which we are all so prone to wearing.
We are. When you realize that the world is broken because of a legal, moral rebellion against a holy God, you can no longer rely on your own efforts to cover your shame or fix your condition.
You can't educate your way out of the curse.
No.
You can't legislate your way out of the curse. It demands a posture of total humility and a reliance on the promised seed who took the curse upon himself.
It demands faith in the substitute.
I want to leave you with a final thought from the text to ponder today. After Adam and Eve were exiled, God placed cherubim and a flaming sword at the east of Eden to guard the tree of life.
A powerful image of judgment.
Access to the presence of God was completely barred by divine justice. Centuries later, those same cherubim figures were woven into the heavy veil of the temple in Jerusalem, guarding the Holy of Holies.
Right. It was a visual reminder to the people that the way into the presence of God was still closed.
The flaming sword was still there. But when the second Adam, Jesus, died on the cross, the historical accounts in the Gospels record that the heavy veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom by an invisible hand.
The way was opened.
Think about what it means that the flaming sword of justice has finally been satisfied, leaving the path back to the tree of life completely open for you.